one of which at least we know was hijacked. And this is the second tower that went just a few minutes ago. A scene of chaos and devastation in the lower part of New York City, right on the edge of the Hudson River. Everybody in the United States is familiar with the Twin Trade Towers, and we have no idea whether there were tourists there who show up every morning to go and stand on the top of the Trade Tower, because it is one of the most expansive views south, west, and north of the city and the area itself. Bill Blakemore is down there. Bill, do you hear me?
I do, Peter.
Go ahead.
I'm just north of Canal Street, just a few blocks north of the Trade Tower area. Throngs of people have been, of course, moving north. Some of them silent, most of them looking stunned, just saying, we're just trying to get out of the area after both towers have collapsed. We're seeing Delta-wing jet fighters circling overhead, just one at a time. When the first one appeared, the group of people amid which I was standing shrieked and said, oh my God, there's another attack. And then they realized that being a Delta-wing jet fighter, it was probably the U.S. military, which of course it seems to be. There's just a couple of helicopters, apparently police helicopters, circling overhead. And on this very clear morning now, the unusual sight is the lack of the trade towers sticking up above the buildings that are normally here. People have now begun to accept, but just barely begun to accept what's happened. All business at a complete standstill, nothing but sirens down here as these throngs move further and further north, just walking away from what they can barely begin to understand. Peter?
Bill, how far north did this, I mean, we looked at some streets which debris had just gone in a huge, wide area.
Right. I seem to be just north of where that hit. I'm just up at Canal, so there seem to have been enough low-lying buildings, that is no more than, say, 20 or 30 stories high, between us and the base of the tower to have protected people here from the debris. But here's another man walking past me, just looking completely dazed, going north. 2 or 3 other women. The crowds are beginning to thin out now, as most of the people who were just standing around and watching were working there. One woman came up just talking a mile a minute with her daughter and her friend and her daughter, describing how they had gone to their school this morning. She was about to go to the Trade Tower to pick up something from a shop there when her daughter said, I want a sandwich, Mommy, and so she stayed back. She said, otherwise I would have been there. They're still trying to understand how they're so lucky not to have been over there. There must be thousands of such stories here this morning, Peter, of those that were the lucky ones.
Thank you, Bill. Please stay in touch as often as you can. It's now 10 minutes to 11 Eastern Time, 10 minutes to East, in 2 minutes to 8 in the West. And I'm just going to add to the chaos and the trauma of the day by saying that a large plane has now crashed just north, or shouldn't I say just, but crashed about 10 o'clock in the last 15 minutes, north of Somerset County Airport, about 80 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. This is reporting from one of the Pittsburgh television stations as a result of a 911 call from the airport itself. There are no other details on this crash yet. And it's not clear whether the crash was related to anything else that has happened in the country today. But the plane, which was believed to be a Boeing 767, crashed about 10 a.m., just about 8 miles east of Jennerston, Pennsylvania. People in the area will undoubtedly be reporting in more clearly to us on that. The New York mayor's race is having a primary today. That has now been canceled. Both on the Republican and the Democratic side, there was I apologize for interruption. Somebody's trying to say something. Go ahead, please. Okay, just stand by just for 1 second while I just finish. Just repeating, the New York mayoralty primary has been canceled today, and as we said, there's reaction coming in from the Middle East, including a claim of responsibility, then a denied responsibility, now a message from the Palestinian President Yasser Arafat condemning the aircraft attacks on the World Trade Center and sending the condolences of the Palestinian people to those who have been victimized by it. Outside the Pentagon, another member of our ABC News staff, Chris Dreer. Chris, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Peter.
So would you tell us what you can see?
Yes,
And-
Peter. I'm standing at the fringe of Arlington Cemetery watching the Pentagon as the top of it caves in. There's a lot of black smoke, a lot of twisted debris. The Pentagon itself has caved in from the top. There is much fire coming out of the windows. It looks like something from World War II, Peter.
Chris, can you tell me, it's a little hard to tell on television, how much of the building has collapsed? How wide is it? How deep is it? Do you have a sense of that?
Yes, I do, Peter. The center portion of the Pentagon appears to be breached. That is, apparently there's a courtyard, and the of that is completely caved in from where I am, from where I see it.
Okay, I think you're on a cell phone, Chris, but just confirm for me that a portion of the building has been breached and the aircraft appears to have pushed its way through into the courtyard?
Yes, indeed it has. I believe, Peter, that that's where the plane is, but I am not sure at this time.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris. Is there any evidence, is there any movement around there at the moment? We're looking at a fairly static picture. Are there people arriving, people disappearing,
Yes,
ambulances
on my side,
coming?
Peter, there's a great deal of glass and wind fire coming out of the windows. But on the other side of the Pentagon is where most of the emergency vehicles are now. I'm going to try and get around to that side to see what I can see.
Okay, thank you very much. I should tell you that all military personnel in the District of Columbia area now, all military personnel in the district, are now on something that is called Threat Level Delta, which is the highest state of alert in the military, and all other military personnel in the country are now on alert status Charlie, which, John Miller, we know is a somewhat lower status of alert, but still a reminder that this disaster has spread like wildfire through all of the political and military establishment in the country. All museums and monuments in Washington are now shut for the day. It's ironic to hear Claire Shipman telling us there that tourists are still standing around waiting to get into the White House today. Not surprisingly, unfamiliar perhaps with what has happened everywhere else, though, as it was, for example, when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, word spread dramatically, mouth to mouth, person to person across the country in a huge wave of information and emotion and confusion. And now I just want to sort of, as often happens, to contradict some of the earlier reporting from Washington. Our State Department sources now believe that there was no car bomb at the State Department, as was reported a little earlier by a number of sources in Washington. We believe there was no car bomb at the State Department, so the State Department at this point is free of violence, but it has been evacuated, as has the Congress, as has the Treasury building. And we've told you several times that the leadership of the House and the Senate, at least the Senate anyway, have been taken to a location which is deemed to be secure. There is still some concern among our intelligence sources in Washington that one more aircraft somewhere is unaccountable, or is unaccounted for, I should just say. Pierre Thomas, I know you're talking as best you can under the circumstances to all of your sources in the FBI. This is your beat. What are they telling you, if anything?
Well, early on today, they were saying that they thought that there was at least one hostage situation in terms of the plane being hijacked, but they were scrambling just as we are, trying to get additional communication, trying to get additional information, and that's one of the problems early on in a disaster like this, is they're trying to get the information in, they're trying to sort through what they have, and then make decisions based on that.
Okay, but does it appear to be an orderly procedure as far as you can tell throughout the country?
Yes, what they do in these cases, the Special Operations Center, which is based at the FBI headquarters in Washington, will go on full alert. The FBI director, Deputy Director Tom Picard, will come down. They will begin to communicate with their facilities throughout the U.S. It's interesting to note, Bob Mueller, the FBI, new director of the FBI,
Hardly been on the job at all.
has not been on the job more than 2 weeks. So he's now being baptized by fire in terms of how to deal with a crisis like this.
Okay, Pierre, thanks very much. Pierre Thomas, who covers the Justice Department and is sitting here working the phones, trying to get through. Because in some respects, what you're looking at on television, with the one exception of the collapse of the buildings in New York City in the last hour, it doesn't begin to convey, and nor can we, the tension in the country from everywhere, because you not only have something happening, but you have all of this reporting coming in from otherwise, from respectable intelligence, information, police agencies saying there are other things to be worried about. John Miller, who's sitting with me, covering New York City in his ear, because he knows these police networks so well, had a sense that the second tower was going to go, and other people must have had the same thing.
They did. The first indication was they started to broadcast reports that they felt it was leaning and that there was a buckle in the northwest corner. And then as you and I were speaking live, they said it's going, and it went.
On the phone with us, I think from Washington at the moment, is Vince Canestraro, with whom we often discuss matters of terrorism. Vince, can you hear me? Vince, can you hear me? Vince Canestraro? Okay, when we make it.
One thing that's
Vince, can you hear me, Vince Canestraro?
Yes, I can.
Okay, well, I don't know what else to do at the moment except to ask your observations on this, because just go ahead.
Well, it's a pretty stunning event, a sequence of events. I think most of the intelligence information available to the U.S. government pointed at attacks at U.S. installations abroad, most recently in Asia. I think that no one had really anticipated a major attack on U.S. soil.
Why not? Come on, Vince, why not? Why
I
should
think
in the wake
because-
of Oklahoma City, in the wake of the attack on the trade towers and all this talk about international terrorism with its tentacles everywhere, why did nobody anticipate it happening here?
I think they anticipated only more sophisticated biological or chemical attacks from terrorist groups. But this was a series of attacks using conventional means, hijacked plane, suicide bombers. I don't think anyone in the intelligence community really anticipated that the terrorist groups that they had identified had the capability to do these kinds of events inside the United States. Now, were they wrong? Obviously. And should they have anticipated a level of cooperation among alienated groups, terrorist groups that wanted to punish the United States? Certainly, they should have. But I don't think anyone anticipated that any of the groups could have done this kind of coordinated, synchronized terrorist events.
Yeah, I
on
want
US
to
soil.
know more about that, Vincent. I don't mean to have you have
Sure.
to defend the intelligence community, but
Sure.
we hear this all the time. Groups are not sophisticated to do this. Did
Right.
the intelligence community fall in love with the notion of biological and chemical attacks and not anticipate that guys could hijack airplanes? They've been doing it since the 1970s.
I don't think there's any question about that. They were anticipating new kinds of threats. All the money in the counterterrorism budget went towards preparation for a BW or nuclear attacks on U.S. soil. But what we have seen time and time again, that terrorists are able to exploit conventional materials in a very devastating way. What McVeigh did at Oklahoma City in 1995, using commercially available materials to some devastating effect, although they weren't the casualties that we see today. But 1993,
Hey, but Vince, let me interrupt you for a second, and I apologize. I sound like
fine.
on the attack here, but there's a feeling in that. You notice I haven't called anybody a terrorism expert this morning.
I don't think anyone wants to be known as a
Thank you
terrorism
very much.
expert
And
today.
but we have a series of terrorism experts who appear in our lives and sometimes sound off knowledgeably. I exclude you from this, by the way, otherwise I wouldn't raise it in your presence. Sound off, knowledgeably about how we know this group and that group and that group. And this is, among other things, a desperate failure of intelligence in both the human and technical area. Am I right?
There's no question about it, Peter. It's a major intelligence failure, the inability to anticipate this kind of a terrorism event on U.S. soil. I think that they were focused on bin Laden in Afghanistan. They were focused on U.S. facilities abroad, and I don't think they believed that bin Laden or a consortium of groups collaborating together had the capability or the willingness to do this kind of thing.
As
Is
Mike-
that a false assumption? Obviously. We saw what they did with the USS Cole last year. It was a very sophisticated U.S. warship that was almost totally destroyed with the loss of 17 lives by suicide bombers.
And just one other thing before I let you go back and work the beat for us, if you would, and that is Osama bin Laden. Some of my colleagues and I argue here about the U.S. emphasis on bin Laden. It's bin Laden, bin Laden, bin Laden. It's if the United States gets only one focus at a time in terms of somebody involved in terrorism. Has the intelligence community fallen in love with the notion that only bin Laden can do this?
No, I don't think they have. They certainly have focused on bin Laden as the bête noire and as the architect of terrorism against U.S. officials, U.S. citizens. But in this case, the resources and the coordination and the direction to do these kinds of events requires capabilities beyond any one single group. In other words, there had to be cooperation, possibly with some state support, to do this kind of thing.
Okay.
I mean, we've been hearing for the last 2 months that bin Laden was getting ready to do something, but I don't think anyone was looking here as the object of his next event.
Okay, Vince, I much appreciate it, and I hope you go work the beat for us and you check back with us through the day. I'm, by the way, this is not for an immediate discussion, but I'm sitting next to John Miller of ABC News, who you've heard often this morning is one of the only reporters in the world to have gone to see Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan. And as the day goes on, we'll clearly deal with this in even greater depth, John, than at the moment. But what we are now dealing with is a devastating human tragedy as the result of terrorism in New York City and in Washington, D.C. And just before I talk to John Cox, well, I'm more than happy to listen to these people on the street if we can possibly hear from them. But just in case, by some remote possibility, at 8 o'clock East, 8 o'clock Pacific time, along the West Coast, you've just turned on your television or you're continuing to watch it, let me just review for you where we think we are at the moment. Because it is both a tragedy that has revealed itself before the eyes of millions of people in the country watching on television, and a complete mystery as to how, as we heard from Vince Calistraro just a moment ago, how this could have happened in such a coordinated way without any of the intelligence services of the United States having much a clue about it. So just before 9 o'clock this morning, just at about 8:50, an aircraft, which we now believe had been hijacked and flew into a building, hit a building. And then shortly after that, that was at 9 o'clock, or just after it, showed up on the wire services about 9:04. We could see it happen live on television as a second aircraft hit the other tower of the twin trade towers in New York City. Thousands of people had just arrived at work. As time passed, we understood that these aircraft had been, we believed, hijacked in both instances. Perhaps certainly one, an American Airlines aircraft which was destined for Los Angeles, had been hijacked and flown. Pilot either forced to fly, very hard to believe, and of course we'll never know unless they find the black boxes from these aircraft or somebody on board that aircraft killed or got rid of the pilot and went to the controls and flew the plane into the building themselves. And then as much of the country began to connect and try to grapple with this, then we had this horrifying circumstances of first one of the towers, this is the second aircraft flying in, then first one of the towers and then the other tower collapsing on itself with at the very least hundreds and probably thousands of people who did not manage to get out of the building after the two initial collisions. And the country, the political and military establishment of the country just began to lock down very quickly. First of all, there was concern at the White House because outside the west side of the White House, behind the Executive Office building, we then began to see that there was fire, and that was what appears now to have been an attack on the Pentagon. Just shortly thereafter, this was this other tower of the Pentagon, the first tower of the Pentagon, which began to fall down upon itself. The World Trade Centers, of course, is what I mean. Thank you. Just stay out of my ear for a second. I'm just trying to bring people up to date on the order of which things happened. So we then had New York City's airspace all around locked down. The airports closed down at LaGuardia and Newark and John F. Kennedy. Nobody was allowed to take off. And then shortly after that, the Federal Aviation Administration became involved and told aircraft nowhere in the country to take off. And then all aircraft flying anywhere in the country, because there was so much concern, and there is still some, that there is an aircraft somewhere out in the country which has been unaccounted for. All aircraft in the country were ordered to land immediately at the nearest airport. And then, of course, the second devastating thing at the trade towers themselves, when the second trade tower collapsed on itself. The president was in Florida, and the president, down in Florida today to talk about education, came very quickly to the cameras, clearly as shocked as any of us in the rest of the country. He talked to the FBI and others. He immediately canceled his education trip to Washington today, to Florida today, and said he was going to come back to Washington, which is exactly what the country expects of him. And he said very briefly on camera that this terrorism against the United States will not stand. As we've said before, the kind of thing he had to say. And John Cochrane went to Florida with him. And John, I think you're still in Florida and the president came home. Is that my understanding?
That's right. We're grounded like all other Americans. The airport here is close to us. The president is on his way back, but we don't know where he's going to land. You know, normally, Peter, the president would land at Andrews Air Force Base, Maryland, a military base, a secure base just outside of Washington, D.C. However, network camera crews have been barred from going to Andrews Air Force Base. It apparently has been roped off and barred to news media. We do not know if the president is going there, and the White House is being very close-mouthed about it. And you can understand why they would want to create the question in some people's minds as to where the president will land. We've been told that when the president returns, he will have a National Security Council meeting. But where will that happen? Will it be in Washington? I can't help but think back to November 22nd, 1963, the assassination of John Kennedy. At that time, the Secret Service was in a great hurry to get the new president, Lyndon Johnson, back to Washington, D.C., a safe place. It's no longer clear today that Washington, D.C. is such a safe place, Peter.
Thank you very much, John. Please stay in touch and let us know when you can make your way to Washington. The uncertainty in Washington has led authorities to ask the political leadership in the Congress, we know at least in the Senate, to go to a safe location. Earlier reports about a bomb outside the State Department, we believe, are now not correct. But there was this attack on the Pentagon, and there's this mixture in Washington of deep, profound tension and almost and alertness. You certainly get a quick glimpse there of the security force, which is a constant presence on the roof of the White House, on guard there. But there is a natural instinct, not only for the president to go to Washington, not merely for the security, because it's the nation's capital, and it's where all of us in the country will look to the president for leadership and response in the hours and the days ahead, and it'll be maybe a couple of hours yet before the president gets to Washington. Meanwhile, on the ground, we have people of all persuasion, eyewitnesses, journalists on the ground, who have been party to seeing this thing and are beginning to piece together for us the human dimension of how horrendous this is. And this, of course, is Times Square, in which you can imagine that people have stopped, and this happens to be the ABC News screen in Times Square, which at a time like this, as Times Square has always been for more than a century, it's always been a place where people gather to see the news. But Drew Milhon, ABC News' Drew Milhon, actually saw this happen, and I believe, Drew, you're on the phone at the moment, am I correct?
Yes, Peter, I'm here.
Would you go ahead?
Sure. I was at the corner of Varick and Canal, which is about 10 to 12 blocks north of the World Trade Center, where roughly 300 to 400 people were gathered watching the flames and the smoke from both World Trade Centers going through the air. And I began to cross the street, and I heard a collective scream from this group of people. And I looked up, and the first World Trade Center that collapsed was falling down. The shriek lasted for quite a long time, and then many of these people fell into tears, just crying and sobbing. I don't know where my mother is. I don't know where my friends are. That sort of thing was heard all around this crowd.
Okay, Drew, and where are you at the moment? You're in the same location?
Yes, I am. I'm at Varick. I'm just north of that now. I'm at Varick and Canal.
And people are not familiar, people from outside New York are not familiar, but you're at the lower west corner of the island of Manhattan. And is that whole lower part of Manhattan being either evacuated or people just leaving it en masse?
It is being evacuated. No cars are allowed south of Canal, which is basically the last major thoroughfare that goes east to west on Manhattan. After the first Trade Center went down, I tried to get closer to the scene, and police and FBI agents were telling everyone, both plainclothes policemen and uniformed policemen were telling everyone they had to go north of Canal. They were pushing everyone back.
Okay, thank you very much, Drew Milhon. Please check in with developments. I can tell you that the reports that we now get from a variety of places, let me just stay with the map of New York City, because the New York City Emergency Management Center is, if you're looking at that map, is just like on the tip of the building there to the north. Both those buildings have gone. And at a moment like this, they and the political establishment in the city, as well as the state and federal authorities, would coordinate operations from in there. And there are other, as you look around that Manhattan itself, as far up as the Williamsburg Bridge and beyond, of course, is the United Nations. People have always been concerned that at least two of the tunnels, the Holland Tunnel for one, the Lincoln Tunnel is not on that map, but these are the tunnels that go across the Hudson River to New Jersey and out onto the west, and that even perhaps the bridges. But elsewhere in the city, City Hall would be vulnerable as well. The United Nations, the tunnels, and of course FBI headquarters, which is about in the middle of Manhattan, not too far from the New York Stock Exchange, which you cannot see on that map at the moment. But there was nothing, John Miller's with me still, thank you very much, and I'm glad you are, nothing more patently, obviously vulnerable than the trade towers.
Or no larger set of symbolic targets. It's what they mean. They stand for American commerce. They stand for the American establishment, and in some way, just by their size and profile, American might. And the fact that they were an earlier target and that they withstood that, I think, made them even a more attractive target the second time around.
You can see people, and again, I'm not quite sure what we're looking at here, and I wish somebody would put pictures up. Okay, this is clearly a New York fire rig. And communications are extremely, extremely difficult, as you can imagine, in a circumstance like this. So
one of the things
sometimes what you get is a picture that is either taken from a different angle or of a different thing.
One of the things they're grappling with here is what is the crime scene. They've been talking about that today. The crime scene unit responded expecting that they'd have a massive crime scene, the World Trade Center tower, then two towers. Then the two towers collapsed, making their crime scene not only much more difficult to process, but massive. Consider the prospect of sifting for evidence, trying to find the black boxes, the in-flight recorders, evidence of other explosives there.
Let me stop for just a sec, John. We'll come back to the notion of crime. But ABC's John McWethy is at the Pentagon. John, can you hear me? Jack, can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you, Peter.
John McWethy, just go ahead and tell us what you know, what you've seen, how much information have you been able to put together?
Peter, this is one of those things that you dream of in your worst nightmares. It appears that a large jet aircraft, perhaps the size of a large passenger plane, came very low, clipping off light poles as it approached the Pentagon. It slammed into the side of the Pentagon, and it drove itself from the outer ring all the way to the inner ring. The area of the building that it went into burst into flames. There are many, many floors of destruction deep into the heart of the Pentagon. That area has now collapsed. The firemen have been there trying to put out the flames. There are obviously heavy casualties at the Pentagon. There have been ambulances and helicopters coming and going for the last hour. The area has been cordoned off. The skies above the Pentagon, there have been F-16s circling. The entire area has been evacuated. More than 20,000 people work in the Pentagon, Peter, and this is a disaster.
John, at ground level, for example, in the side of the building where the plane penetrated from the outer ring to the inner ring, Do you know precisely what goes on in that section of the building?
I do not, Peter. That is not where the highest-ranking people are. The Secretary of Defense and most of the chiefs of the services are on a different side of the building, but in a way it almost doesn't matter. There are going to be many high-ranking people from the Defense Department who are going to be either injured or killed in this attack.
And, John, is this something which the Pentagon is trying to take care of wholly itself? I mean, are we talking to you about a circumscribed military operation to emerge from this chaos?
It's very difficult, Peter. The FBI is here, local police are here, everyone is here trying to deal with the casualties initially and trying to make sure there isn't a second strike of any kind. That's the first inclination. That's all I can tell you at this point.
All right, let me ask you, John, because you cover intelligence and counterintelligence a lot of the time, trying to see that a second strike doesn't occur. How is the Pentagon defended in any way, and in any way similar to, for example, the anti-aircraft battery on top of the White House?
No, Peter. This Washington, D.C., because it is a democracy, has made a lot of decisions about how it is going to posture itself. And local law enforcement, FBI, and CIA have relied on intelligence as a way to defend the United States, and they're going to have to add some measures as a result of this.
And John, as it may be too chaotic at the moment to be talking to people about what is an intelligence failure this morning, and the intelligence services are going to have an enormous amount to answer for, clearly, at least in the public arena. Are you picking up anything that suggests anybody has the vaguest idea of who may have done this?
They are going back over every strand of intelligence, looking for either groups in the Middle East or anywhere else in the country. They learned a painful lesson after Oklahoma City, not to jump to conclusions. They're trying not to do this. But, Peter, there are very few organizations on the planet that could put together the kind of coordinated attack that we have seen today. That points most initial fingers at Osama bin Laden's organization that has the money and the sophistication to do this.
Okay, John, thank you very much. I don't think we should be at all surprised that Osama bin Laden moves to the top of everybody's list in this. But John McCarthy makes a very interesting point, which we should talk to John Miller about this for a moment, which we should consider throughout the day. I remember sitting in this exact same chair at the time of the Oklahoma City bombing, and we all thought it was a Middle East attack. We all thought it was the Arabs attacking the United States, and that's where much of the violence is these days, but it was a sort of knee-jerk reaction, then it turned out to be one of our own.
That's right, and it was a conclusion that was jumped to by the law enforcement establishment because it seemed to fit the pattern of conduct, a massive truck bomb. The difference was it was stateside, yet they were certainly surprised when they learned within days, actually with a car stop of Timothy McVeigh, that it was a homegrown plot. These are bellwether events. When the World Trade Center blew up in New York City in 1993, everybody sighed and said, well, we said it couldn't happen here, and it finally has. When Oklahoma City blew up, they said, we knew it could happen here, but we never thought it would be brought on by our own. This event certainly transcends either of those events by several fold. And of course, as you pointed out, people are already jumping to speculative conclusions. But whoever is behind this put together an incredibly sophisticated program. Just the idea that you would have multiple operators in multiple cities with the ability to get onto a plane with either the weaponry or false weaponry or explosives to be able to pull off a hijacking, again, probably with a locked cockpit.
Three of them, maybe.
Again, a hijacking and another hijacking and another, and maybe one that's still aloft, that you would be able to, and this is the part that has confounded me, and you touched on this, how do you make a pilot in a plane full of passengers into a suicide pilot, a kamikaze to slam into a building? And if you do not, how do you, as the terrorist, have the level of sophistication to take over the controls of a sophisticated airliner jet plane to be able to fly accurately into targets like hitting dead center into the Pentagon, which is a low a low building.
You heard John McCarthy saying knocking off telephone poles, knocking down telephone poles as it came along.
Dead hits into the World Trade Center, one at the center, one near the top. As you pointed out, there's a lot of mystery to this, confounding mystery, an incredible scope.
Let's listen to this woman quickly. Well, we try to listen to this woman, not able to get her sound. Could somebody please turn up her sound if that's possible? We are looking at, in some cases here, because of the communications difficulties, but also the communication benefits we get from our ABC affiliate here in New York City. We're getting coverage which comes from a variety of sources.
What you're seeing is West Street there, a block north of the World Trade Center. That was an emergency service police officer collapsing on the street.
Let's listen to this man. Okay. Can I just ask our director to come to us for just a second then? I think it... Mr. Goodman? Thank you very much. Let's just continue to review. There's a hard issue here for an enormous number of people. What you've seen on television this morning, those twin trade towers first being hit and then collapsing before our A's has an almost distant, we talked to both Pierre and John, it has one distant quality to it because we're watching on television. We're so accustomed to violence on television. So accustomed, I mean, when the plane flew into one of the two towers which we saw before our eyes, you thought, well, you know, it's like the graphic artist, isn't it? So what we haven't had here yet is an appreciation of the suffering that's occurring on the streets and in those buildings.
Well, what the widening scope of the injuries, they have now notified hospitals in the outlying boroughs outside Manhattan, and they have cleared routes through the streets, covering miles, for caravans of ambulances to bring the injured out as they do the triage. The lower Manhattan and central Manhattan hospitals like Bellevue quickly filled up very early on. They have now set up a system of helicopters, which they have to be very careful with because of the ban on air traffic, that everybody knows who everybody is who's flying and that there's communications between all of them to shuttle people out. The military has offered military aircraft for that kind of transport, and military surgeons have been brought to the scene. One thing unfolding right now is they've asked for gas to be shut off in that area for blocks and blocks because after the two collapses, gas mains were opened up and there's a gas leak in the air which only fosters the danger of yet more explosions.
Exactly. Pierre?
Well, one of the things that they've been very concerned about in recent years is the notion that could hospitals deal with massive amounts of casualties like this. And now they're going to...
Let me just interrupt you for a second so we hear it as it's happening.
Just come out, we're walking.
It's just come down. The second everyone's being asked to get down, come down. The people are now panicking again.
Give him here. You can watch. You can film it. You can. Make a hole. Make a fucking hole. Make a fucking hole. Make a fucking hole. Back up.
Well, a scene that's been repeated hundreds and hundreds of, as far as we know, thousands of times. The reports in John Miller was talking about the number of hospitals and the military making its medical staff available to the citizen, to the layman hierarchy here. We've had reports from various hospitals saying that hundreds of people are burned from head to toe. One doctor at St. Vincent's Hospital in Lower Manhattan just simply said the place was crowding up very quickly by people who had been burned. And the horrifying magnitude of all this is to be reminded. I think I'm going to try to get this right, Nancy, but I think maybe as many as 50,000 people work in the immediate area of the Trade Center, of the World Trade Center, in which there are these two twin towers. Am I right on that as many as 50,000 people work at?
I don't know the figure, but the World Trade Center complex, not just the two towers, which are, you know, over 100 stories each, but they're flanked by the World Financial Center. So there are clearly tens of thousands of people within a 2-block radius.
And John McWethy, who called in just a short while from the Pentagon, talking about the aircraft that had penetrated the outer ring of the Pentagon to the inner ring, we're talking about the Pentagon now, had many floors of destruction and heavy casualties. It's just impossible at the moment to grasp, other than to try to aggregate the normal circumstances of how many people live and work in the immediate area. And thousands of people work in the Pentagon every day, which has now been overrun by local police and by state authorities and by the military itself trying to take care of its own. Tony Cordesman, who's one of our military analysts, is on the phone from Washington. Tony, what can you add to all this?
Yes. Peter, can you hear me?
Yes, Tony, I can.
I think one of the things we need to understand is we've been preparing for this kind of event for nearly a decade. We've had presidential directives. It's a project called Homeland Defense, but quite frankly, what people were most worried about was the use of weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons. While we looked at this scenario, hijacked aircraft flying into buildings back in the 60s, it wasn't the focus of Homeland Defense activity. It wasn't something brought up on the screen of the Vice President's office, which formally is in charge with coordinating this effort.
But Tony, I know, been party to a lot of these. Is that speaker I hear behind you?
Yes,
Could you just turn around and ask somebody to turn it down?
Hold on, please. I'm on to Peter. Could you turn it down?
Thanks very much. Sorry to interrupt them because they're all doing a job. But your involvement here is important because you've been involved in so much of planning and study of this operation. I don't get it. In the 1960s, yes, we looked at the possibility that people would hijack airplanes and fly into buildings. How did it get off the radar?
I think the problem, Peter, is literally we have tens of thousands of points of vulnerability. As Jack McWethy pointed earlier, it's the Pentagon. It's symbols of our national heritage, like the National Archives. It's major utilities, nuclear power plants, targets like ABC News and the networks. The problem is that anticipating all these points of vulnerability in a democratic society and defending them is almost impossible. There's always been this area of vulnerability, and we've always put civil liberties and civil rights before trying to deal with a comprehensive defense. This may change those priorities. It certainly is something short, if not actually at the level of an act of war.
And Tony, you have seen us this morning, or heard us this morning, go through the ritual of reciting that somebody had claimed responsibility, someone had denied responsibility. The Palestinian Authority in the person of Yasser Arafat was very quick to come along and offer condolences to the people of the United States, to put as much distance between himself, because he gets blamed for a lot in the Middle East, certainly by the Israelis. I guess it was before you went into Afghanistan. They attacked his camp, so they didn't get him.
They sent 75 cruise missiles at $1 million apiece into his camps based on intelligence that he would be meeting there with his leadership.
Right.
He was not there, and they didn't get him. They destroyed his camps. I think that at the time or point that the government and the Bush administration identifies, not to the standard, and this is the way they've been working, not to the standard you would need to prove in court, but to the satisfaction of the administration that they know who's responsible. They will not deal with this as a criminal matter first, but as a military one first, and retaliate against someone somewhere. Too early to say who. One of the things about bin Laden that is so misunderstood, and his name has come up a few times today, is how he actually operates. More so than launching these operations himself at his direction from his own organization. And there are instances where he's charged with doing exactly that. In many more of the cases, especially of operations they shut down, the U.S. government takes the position that he's basically a foundation, that any terrorist group can approach him and say, we want to go to work. He'll provide the training, the financing, and then send them off to do their work, essentially with grant money. seed money, training, logistical support. So it doesn't necessarily have to be him to have his fingerprints on it.
Fires are still burning in the Pentagon, no surprise there. As John McCarthy and Barbara Starr both reported for us, this building penetrated the outer ring of the Pentagon and set many offices on fire on a variety of levels, and there are about 6 or 7 stories. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stories anyway in the Pentagon today. In at least one section, they are alight. And as I said a couple of times, the Palestinian President Yasser Arafat, who's deeply engaged in a war now with the Israeli government, has also reacted very quickly to this today to express, to be perfectly honest, I haven't heard what he said, but so let's hear what he said now. This is Palestinian President Yasser Arafat.
First of all, I am offering my condolences, the condolences of the Palestinian people to the American President, President Bush, to his government, to the American people for this terrible act. We are completely shocked, unbelievable.
Now, that's the Palestinian president, chairman of the Palestine Liberation Organization, Yasser Arafat, who, as I think everybody who watches the news or reads the news these days understands, is in a very, very bitter war with the Israelis, and in which terrorism has been a factor. Palestinians see what the Israelis do to them as terrorism, and certainly the Israelis and much of the world see the Palestinian and other suicide bombers who've attacked inside Israel to be terrorism of the most gruesome order, no question about that. And so we should not be surprised, as on previous circumstances, to see Chairman Arafat expressing his condolences, but other Palestinians who believe the United States is responsible for what Israel is doing to the Palestinians, or at least complicit and is certainly supplying the Israelis arms, will be happy to see this attack on the United States today. So take a look at a scene from Jerusalem not too long ago in which there is some celebration that the powerful United States has been harmed, has been seen to be vulnerable, has been hurt, I suppose, in the broadest sense of the word. And the people who go off to do this sort of thing, both in the Middle East now, you must remember that a vast majority of the population of the Middle East now, in all countries, is under 21, much of it under 15, certainly under 17, and the kind of tensity and intention, if one presumes this terrorism, one shouldn't, this terrorism has had its genesis or had its roots somewhere in the Middle East, or at least in people who are opposed, are just filled, brimming with anger at the United States. And we are now becoming more experienced with the notion that there are young men, for the most part, who are prepared to blow themselves up along with everybody else in terms terms if they can be a service to the cause. And and they believe, as do some people believe about Islam, that they will, by sacrificing themselves, go on to another place. It's an unfair comment on Islam in some respects, but it is certainly a motivating factor. The hatred of the United States, and the hatred of the United States is a hatred of Israel. Whether you're from Afghanistan, or whether you're from Iran, Iraq, or inside the Palestinian territories, is so intense at some levels, and has become more intense in recent months, that a great many people will not be surprised at this attack today, though, like everybody else, will be amazed at the magnitude and success of it. John McWethy at the Pentagon. John.
Peter, we are standing outside the Pentagon at this point. It has been already a long morning for rescue workers and police here. One eyewitness I talked to, who was on this busy highway outside the Pentagon this morning, said he saw an airplane coming directly over his head. It was an American Airlines plane. He could see the number on the plane. He could almost see the passengers inside as it went along the highway, started clipping off the high wires and the different light poles along the highway, and slammed directly into the side of the Pentagon. As we said earlier, Peter, the aircraft penetrated deep inside the Pentagon. It is organized in rings from the E ring on the outside. It penetrated all the way into the A ring in the inner part of the Pentagon. After it burned for a number of minutes, a part of the building collapsed. By the time rescue workers could get in there, the destruction was just terrific.
John, do you have any sense of the casualties?
We don't have any sense, Peter, except the size of the medical operation that has been set up here is enormous. They are anticipating the casualties. Certainly the injured will be in the hundreds. I certainly don't want to speculate on those killed.
And John, it's a little hard to get a sense of the size sometimes for the picture. Can you describe, maybe in feet or in yards, how big a penetration this is?
The roof has collapsed, Peter. There is a chasm in the side of the Pentagon that is probably 200 or 300 feet across. From the roof of the Pentagon, there is this huge V shape that has collapsed. You can see deep inside the Pentagon from the street now.
This is into the inner courtyard of the Pentagon itself.
It's into the innermost ring of the Pentagon, Peter. I have not been able to get into the courtyard, but I was told that the penetration was all the way into the deepest ring of the Pentagon.
And John, the office building, the Pentagon is about, what, 6 stories high?
It's 5 stories above ground, Peter, and several stories below. Clearly the damage is primarily above ground, but also some of those in the lower offices. I was sitting in the Pentagon when the attack happened. I was on the opposite side of the building. It shook the entire building. It was very clear that something terrible had happened. There was chaos immediately after the attack, Peter. Secretary of Defense, I walked out with the Deputy Secretary of Defense. The Marine Corps Commandant couldn't get out the door because security had locked it. It was chaos.
Okay, John, and the fires are still burning at the moment, we believe?
They are still burning. They are mostly oil fires, it appears, Peter. The fire hoses have been on the various fires for the last several hours, so they're beginning to put them out. But obviously there is still heavy gray smoke coming out of that portion of the Pentagon that was so terribly damaged.
John, there are a couple of aircraft at least around the country today which are still unaccounted for. You gave a very clear description earlier of how this aircraft had approached the Pentagon. But did anybody able to identify it as an aircraft associated with an airline?
Absolutely, Peter. The eyewitness I talked to looked up and said it was an American Airlines plane. I saw it clear as could be. It went right over the top of my car and clipped a pole right in front of where my car was.
Thank you very much, John McCarthy. I actually think that you may have said that earlier, and I simply lost it in terms, just lost it. And so we now know that it was, from at least one eyewitness there, it was an American Airlines aircraft which crashed into the Pentagon. So let me just try to get some grasp on the airplane. We have 2 United flights, a 757, which was on its way from New York to San Francisco, which crashed near Pittsburgh. We have a United flight which crashed from Boston to Los Angeles, United 175, and we do not know where that aircraft has crashed or been crashed as of now. And we have these 2 American flights, one from Boston to Los Angeles, which is a 767 with 81 passengers and 11 crew on board. We're talking about almost 100 people on American Flight 11. And American Flight 77, which was scheduled from Washington to Los Angeles, with 58 passengers and 6 crew members on board. And John Miller and I have been sitting here looking at each other about where these flights were going. And there's several ways to speculate about it, but you came up with one very interesting on already.
From a forensic standpoint, if you look operationally to crash these flights, it would have been just as simple to get on the Washington shuttle or the New York shuttle and crash one into the Trade Center and the other in the Pentagon. The choice of flights here, Newark to San Francisco, Boston to L.A., Dulles to L.A.
Excuse me, John, I apologize. Let me come back just because we have the New York governor here.
Sure.
Governor George Pataki, the governor of New York, I believe, is on the telephone or somewhere. Governor Pataki, do you hear me?
Yes, Peter, I hear you fine.
Well, why don't you first start off, sir, and give us your appraisal of the day so
Well,
far.
it's just a horrific scene, and everybody's pulling together. We're activating the state emergency forces, but our hearts and prayers are with the victims and the families of those victims, and we have to, at this point, just focus on trying to help as many people whose lives are at risk as possible and dealing with those who have been injured.
Do you have some sense of the magnitude of casualties?
We don't want to quantify a number, but obviously it's a horrific incident that really is just an incredible outrage against the people of New York and the people of America. But at this point, our focus is on trying to make sure that those whose lives are still at risk are as protected, and those who have been injured are treated as quickly and as well as possible.
Governor, do you believe that thousands of people have been killed?
I don't want to use a number, Peter. At this point, the goal is simply to try to help as many people as possible. We're working closely with the city, with our National Guard forces coming in to help relieve the city police and fire. Obviously, it's a situation that just cries out for people to be horrified. But what we have to do at this point is focus on helping those who are at risk, helping those who have been injured, making sure there's an orderly removal from Lower Manhattan, and that is our focus at this point.
Governor, are you in a position to go to the scene? Are you in a position to go to Lower Manhattan? Do you think you should? Would you like to? Or are you locked down?
No, I'm in the city, but the important thing is to be able to stay in contact with the White House, with City Hall, with our statewide emergency services. We've gotten offers of support from all the surrounding states with their emergency services, and the critical thing right now is to be able to coordinate to make sure that the response is the strongest and the most compassionate it can be for the people whose lives are still at risk. And we're mobilizing National Guard units from across the state. We're getting help from the surrounding states and coordinating with the city, and that's what we have to do at this point.
And Governor, what have you done about the other so-called high-profile potential targets in New York City, like the UN and the bridges and things like this? Are they all evacuated and locked down now?
UN's evacuated. The tunnels have been closed. The George Washington Bridge is open under security for emergency services coming in and people going out. We've shut down most of the mass transit. Grand Central is open under very tight security, but people who pass through the security have limited service to the northern suburbs, and we're doing the same thing on Long Island. But the important thing now is to provide as much help as quickly and as effectively to those whose lives are at risk or those who've been injured, and we're working with the city and federal officials to make sure that happens.
Do you believe that New York City is now under control?
New York City has been under attack, and until we get through this, we just have to continue to respond as strongly as we can.
And are you in a profile now? Are you in a position where you actually think there's a potential for more?
We just don't know. That's why we have to not only help those who have been injured, but also take every security step we can to try to prevent further incidents. We just don't know, Peter.
Okay. Governor Pataki, thank you very much. Governor George Pataki of New York, who is in New York City, which, of course, is where he probably belongs at a moment like this. Downtown Manhattan is saying simply that the National Guard has been called in, the tunnels are closed, the George Washington Bridge, which goes across the Hudson River from the west side of Manhattan into New Jersey. Just remember, a large segment of many thousands of people from New Jersey work in New York, and there's tremendous commerce back and forth on a daily basis. That has all been brought to a help. It's interesting to recall, John Miller, that the attack on the trade towers in '93 was launched from New Jersey, or at least the operational headquarters of the people who attacked the Trade Center were in New Jersey.
Correct. And the building of the bomb and the original conspiracy was all carried out in towns right across the river. In fact, The conspirators later admitted that they watched from New Jersey to see if the buildings would in fact fall, and they didn't. This time they did.
They did today. And Governor Pataki trying, as politicians again must on occasions like this, trying to express the horror and the commitment that the political establishment feels to those people who've died and those people who need to be rescued. He doesn't answer to every question about whether or not something was locked down or something. He came back every time that their priority now is to try to help those people who are in deep and, in some cases, still desperate trouble. George Stephanopoulos, one of our senior reporters, is downtown. Hey, George, where have you been? What have you seen? What do you think?
Well, Peter, I'm going to give you kind of a pool report from several of our correspondents down here of basically what happened down here in downtown New York between 9:45 and 10:45 when the two explosions and the collapse of the World Trade Center happened. At the time, I was actually in the subway heading towards the World Trade Center right around Franklin Street, and after the first explosion, the subway station started to fill with smoke. The subway cars started to fill with smoke, and the subways actually stopped. They then diverted us around the World Trade Center to Park Place, which is one stop beyond the World Trade Center. We got to that train station at around 10:35, Peter, and it was a scene unlike I've ever seen before in my entire life. As we tried to get out of the subway station and walk up into the street, it was pitch black, midnight black, snowing soot all down through downtown Manhattan. This was about 2 blocks from the World Trade Center. You couldn't see a foot in front of your face at that time. We then worked our way back uptown. All of the firefighters and police officials and National Guard are now evacuating everyone out of lower Manhattan. They're going east towards Brooklyn and north, which is where we are now, up on Canal Street. I should add as well, Peter, we had one of our reporters was downtown and had a sight line of the World Trade Center at around 9:48, which is around the time I believe the first tower collapsed, Gloria Rivera, and she saw 2, then 3, then 4 people jump out of the top floors of the World Trade Center. She was with a firefighter who said, they're not falling, they're jumping. Watch their arms waving, and they counted 12 people jump off the top floors.
Do you want to continue, George?
Well, right now, as I said, they are evacuating everyone else out. But just to give you another sense, Peter, all over lower Manhattan, the sidewalks, the streets are covered with about 1/4 to 1/2 inch of dust, of soot, as if it were Pompeii. Most people are pretty calm right now. They're evacuating slowly as the firefighters come in. But it really was one of the most frightening, horrific scenes I've ever seen in my life.
Thanks, George, very much. Come back anytime with a report. I just, as you were concluding there, watching these guys go up that escalator, and if it's in the World Trade Center, we know that their cameraman got out, but we don't know about anybody else because, within an hour and something of the time these 2 attacks had occurred, these 2 buildings had completely disappeared, and you begin increasingly to see more dramatic footage. George Stephanopoulos made a reference to Pompeii near Naples on the west coast of Italy, which was, buried by a volcano, and you get exactly that same sense of freezing stuff in soot and dirt, as might have occurred by a volcano. Jim Kallstrom, with whom we're long familiar, former official of the FBI in the New York office, is on the air, very deeply involved in the Flight TWA 800 investigation. Jim, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
What do you think?
Peter?
I'm listening, Jim. I just say, what do you think? I mean, just start and I'll...
Well, my first thought is with the tremendous casualties and the death toll is just overwhelming. It's a day that 50 years from now our children, if we're still teaching history, will be taught about when we went to war on American soil with terrorism.
Jim, if you had a chance to talk to your more active colleagues in the FBI at the moment about what they're doing at the moment, whether they're able to, I mean, it seems the hardest thing at the moment is to make an appraisal of all this. It just happened, and it's just, in some respects, it's happened and it's happening, right?
Peter, you're right. I mean, it happened. It's shocking, but in some ways it isn't shocking. I mean, we've had, the hatred of America played out at the Trade Center in '93. They tried to take the Trade Center down. We've had the hatred played out in the USS Cole, the bombings of our embassies in Africa, the bombings of the barracks in Saudi Arabia. So now it's being played out big time here in the United States.
Jim, what is the principal goal of the FBI at a moment like this, when all of the emergency services are brought to bear in all of these locations? What's the FBI actually doing at the moment?
I think the first concern of the FBI right now, right this second, is there going to be something else happening in the next 5 minutes, 30 minutes, hour, 12 hours? Simultaneous with that, who did it? Where are they? What do we know? What's the intelligence base? Tell us. Why didn't we see this coming? Where do we go from here? What kind of articulate, defined information can we give the National Command Authority so that we can bring the necessary massive retaliation necessary without a lot of collateral damage?
Well, Jim, thank you very much for checking in with us, and please do at any time if you have news. That photo, as Jim was talking, Jim Kallstrom, the former director of the FBI here, and a major force in the investigation of TWA 800, which blew up off the south coast of Long Island.
And the principal operator in the first World Trade Center bombing. Key investigator.
Right. But it's interesting, forgive me, no offense intended him, he doesn't have much to say either today, because in some respects there isn't much to say except the horror of it. But as we were looking at just a moment ago, listening to George Stephanopoulos talking to our reporters who witnessed the horrifying jump of some people from the top of the trade towers, you just saw a hint of the just ahead of this little piece of video here before, you saw a hint of what people were enduring at the top of the trade towers before they collapsed as a result of the intensity of the fire. And we've seen it before in other places around the world. Fire starts in a place, people often, ironically, not that it would have made any difference today, do the wrong thing, they get trapped in an open window by fire coming into their room, and finally they just jump, simply because if they don't jump, they're probably going to be burned alive. But as we have heard from, it's interesting that Governor Pataki is so nervous, and I don't blame him for a second, wanting to stay away from the magnitude of the casualties here today. But as John McKenzie reported from the fire department downtown, we got 200 fire department officials, 200 firefighters missing. I don't know whether or not this is a firefighter who's been brought, but you see in every case people getting oxygen because it isn't if it isn't collapse that kills in some cases like this, it is the deadly smoke. Anybody who's been involved in a fire knows the deadly smoke which suffocates people in a circumstance like this. But we are only getting touches, and it doesn't even have the chaos associated with it in many cases. We're just getting touches now of what has happened in these variety of places. The Pentagon are being kept, quite logically, I think, back at